How about states that receive U.S. aid and/or our allies? Legitimacy and security has been and remains a sensitive issue in Saudi Arabia. We know that from the seizure of the mosque in 1978-79 to Osama bin Laden and al-Qaeda and more recent acts of terrorism. They remain issues in Egypt, in Jordan, in Pakistan, and again in some of the Gulf states. Oil states can use their wealth to buy levels of stability, but as Saudi Arabia has proven, that isn't enough often. That deeper issues have to be addressed. And then just a couple of final comments. When we look at, it seems to me, the levels of radicalization in Iraq and elsewhere in the Middle East, there's a dynamic interaction with issues of power sharing and economic development, deep issues of religious identity, slant nationalism, and that connection, that religious identity, slant nationalism, and the Israeli-Palestinian issue, and more recently the blowback from Gaza and Lebanon. And this is going to have a significant effect. The blowback is really quite significant if you look at recent surveys in Lebanon, but even some recent surveys in Indonesia in terms of changes of attitudes. And the way in which the U.S. is seen as sitting on its hands, the U.S. is seen as compliant, and you have these kinds of lines that we may find easy to dismiss, but they're not. You know, people wind up in the region saying to you, well, wait a minute, Hezbollah was firing off rockets during this go, and at the end of the day, and they really couldn't kind of control them, and so where they landed could be dangerous. But then you had this kind of systematic use of cluster bombs and the magnitude of that destruction, and somehow that magnitude really doesn't seem to have been acknowledged sufficiently by the American media and by many governments. Radical fundamentalist way of legitimating and mobilizing is to claim that the state of Iraq after the war, coupled with the inability to solve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and most recently the U.S.-Israeli, as this is seen, a U.S.-Israeli war in Lebanon and Gaza, are the biggest indicators of the character, intentions, and failure of the West, especially the United States. And I think that that's an issue. I'd be happy to talk a little bit more later on about other issues, but I know time is limited, and so I figured I'd beat him as he's writing that I have no more time. Thank you.
Thanks, John. Thanks very much. TX?
Great. Morning. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm just going to start right in with insurgency and counterinsurgency, what's the same and what's different. There's been an argument, which frankly I was one of the ones who tried to start it, on the validity of fourth-generation warfare. Let's forget about the argument about the model and instead focus on what the model tries to tell us. Is the war evolves from society, political, economic, social, and then finally the technical aspects. And this just sounds like common sense. I mean, Clausewitz said it. It's been pretty obvious for a couple hundred years, everywhere except inside the Pentagon. And we still haven't got that message. The Pentagon still thinks there's a technology that if we just figure out the technology, it'll get us out of this mess. So that's what the fight, those of us who started fourth generation wanted to have the fight about. Frankly, we haven't been successful in the Pentagon. What has happened in war, though, that has made this change? The war we would really like to fight is World War II again, because their technology really made a huge difference. But wars evolved since the 1940s to the point that I'm willing to say that today irregular warfare is the dominant form of war. If you look at wars since World War II, conventional wars all end in a return to the status quo. Korea, the Falklands, the series of Arab-Israeli wars. Even though there is a, quote, victor, it ends up being the situation returns about pretty much where it was. Whereas irregular wars, even the ones where the counterinsurgent wins, like Malaya, Peru, El Salvador, there are major social and political changes, which is what they went to war for. So if you're looking at the fact that war is about changing the situation, then irregular war gets it done. Now, the underlying nature of war never changes. This is something else the Pentagon hasn't figured out. I don't care how much technology you have, you will not do away with fog and friction. One of the things the network-centric people are big on is that complexity is a measure of the number of nodes in the system. I've been married for 33 years. There's only 2 nodes in this marriage, and half the time I don't know what the hell's going on. And that illustrates the point that it's really about people. It's not about technology or number of entities in it things. What does change is the character of the war never changes. So what's the enduring characteristics of insurgency? The first and most important is that it is political in nature, not military. Everybody understands the West's critical vulnerability is our political will. They were talking about this on their websites from early 2002. In fact, the first time my work was ever widely quoted was by Al-Qaeda. When they wrote after the attack where we went into Afghanistan, they said, don't worry about it, we're going to use fourth generation, and this is how we're going to stretch this out and break their political will. It's evolved since Ho and Mao, since the insurgents now believe no military victory is necessary. You will break their political will, the outside power will withdraw, and then you'll get into the real war, which is the civil war that's going to happen inside your own boundaries. It uses those international boundaries, and one of the interesting aspects with our love of technology is that pretty regularly the low technology side wins. The argument that no one has ever won a war without air superiority is not quite true. They're protracted, think decades, and this is another problem we really have in the US. We really want to think a long war is 3 or 4 years. The Chinese fought for 27, the Vietnamese for 30. The Palestinians have been at it since 1968. So for the English majors in the class, that's 36 years. The course is really the poverty of dignity that Dr. Esposito explained so clearly. It's not about specific causes as much about as I have no control of my life. And whatever I'm rallying around, whether it's the Tamils, the Chechens, the Sunnis, Islamic, it's really about getting control and having a say in how my life runs. Now, two of the most interesting recent things, the nation-state lateral escalation. We still don't know exactly what the sequence was between Iran and Hezbollah in Lebanon. But it's pretty clear that the lesson Iran can take from that is if we get too pushy in Iran, they can escalate laterally into Lebanon, into Iraq, into Afghanistan, and if need be, even into Saudi Arabia, I think. And then one other big lesson, of course, is failure of our strategic communication. In fact, our strategic communication is not only bad, it's working for the other side. It's, as you mentioned, providing tremendous impact for the other side. And we can talk about specific examples in the question and answer if you want. So those are the enduring characteristics. It's political and it's protracted and it's network is the emerging characteristic. Whereas the old Ho and Mao model, you had these kind of odd assemblies of people, but early on they had their fights. And the Chinese, between the 20s to the mid-30s, they sorted out who was going to be in charge and they killed the rest. Ho did the same thing. He thinned it down so there's only one way of doing things in those insurgencies. But since then, what we've seen is these coalitions of the willing emerge, which was what we saw in Afghanistan back when insurgents were the good guys and we were supporting them. That was not a unified Islamic insurgency. There were 7, the Peshawar 7, which were the most unified we had, spread across the spectrum. And then, of course, you have Northern Alliance and a whole bunch of other players in the game. But this is the way it's happening. They're resilient, they're flexible, and they're fast. And that's why they like networks, because it gives them a better chance to operate. External actors will join any conflict now. Because of the globalization of the world, there is a guy sitting there somewhere who's unhappy with his life and is looking for a war to get into. I mean, this has gone on throughout history. People wander off to the Abraham Lincoln Brigade in the Spanish Civil War. They'll continue to do this, but it's just easier now. Wars are now transnational. Actors are neither a single nationality nor in a single nation. They are transdimensional. I made that word up. And at one point I put it on a PowerPoint slide, so I will go to hell for that. But I couldn't think of another word for how they're operating. They are operating both in cyber and real time, and is very, very smooth transition between. They're running full-scale universities. When we dried up their training camps in Afghanistan, they moved to the web. Many of them are based on US servers. They'll hack into a US server. The Arkansas Fish and Game Department was running a jihad training site, they just didn't know it. So we've got to work on that. They're also self-supporting. It used to be you could go after their sponsors. Now more and more they're self-supporting in fundraising, charity organizations, legitimate businesses, and more criminal activity. In fact, it becomes hard to tell the criminal where the criminal activity stops and the insurgent activity starts. This is all part of this blurring up and fuzziness of war. But all of that really reflects how the world is organized today in terms of global networks, that alliances or temporary businesses move in together, they break up for the next contract. All of that is going on continually.